You've probably noticed that the more conscious you become, the harder it is to connect with the people around you, that conversations seem empty, others' concerns appear trivial, and you feel increasingly like a foreigner in your own world. Michel Foucault, one of the most provocative thinkers of the 20th century, dedicated his life to exposing something that most people will never perceive, that we live in an invisible prison, built not with iron bars, but with social norms, expectations, and systems of control so subtle that we can't even see the chains that bind us. And here's the most disturbing part. If you're alone, if you feel isolated, if people have drifted away from you without you understanding exactly why, maybe it's not because there's something wrong with you. Maybe it's because you've already escaped. You've awakened. And in a world of prisoners who don't know they're imprisoned, the free man will always seem like the madman. Foucault spent decades studying how society controls not just our bodies, but our minds, how it teaches us what to think, what to desire, who to be. He showed that power doesn't just come from governments or visible authorities, but from something far more insidious, from surveillance systems, social norms, discourses that shape our very perception of reality. And when you begin to see these mechanisms, when you start questioning the rules everyone follows without thinking, something inevitable happens. You become a problem, not because you're aggressive or rebellious, but because your mere existence questions the structure that keeps everyone else comfortably asleep. If you've been feeling like you don't belong, like people avoid you without clear reason, like your loneliness increases as your consciousness expands, Foucault would say you're not failing socially. You're experiencing the inevitable cost of escaping from a prison that no one else recognizes as a prison. Today, I'm going to reveal Foucault's most radical analysis of power, control, and freedom. Why those who awaken inevitably become outsiders. How society subtly punishes anyone who questions its invisible norms. And why your loneliness might be the clearest sign that you're finally free. Foucault began his career studying something most philosophers ignored: institutions, prisons, psychiatric hospitals, schools, clinics. He wasn't interested in grand abstract theories about truth or morality. He wanted to understand how power actually works at the most concrete level, how it shapes bodies, behaviors, identities. And what he discovered was terrifying. Modern power doesn't function primarily through brute force or obvious repression. It functions through normalization, through teaching us what's normal, acceptable, healthy, productive, and then constantly surveilling us to ensure we conform. In his most famous book, Discipline and Punish, Foucault describes the Panopticon, a prison designed by philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Imagine a circular structure with a watchtower in the center. From this tower, a guard can see all the cells, but the prisoners never know when they're being observed. The cruel brilliance of the design is that eventually the prisoners begin to police themselves. They internalize the guard's gaze. They become their own jailers. Foucault realized that modern society functions exactly like this. We live in a social panopticon. Cameras everywhere, social media profiles constantly judged, productivity metrics at work, behavioral standards in every interaction. And most importantly, we internalize this surveillance. We police ourselves. We constantly ask ourselves, how do others see me? Am I behaving correctly? Am I meeting expectations? This is the fundamental mechanism of modern control. We don't need guards with guns. We become our own guards. And here's what this means for someone who begins to awaken. The moment you stop policing yourself in this way, the moment you stop caring so much about what others think, the moment you start acting according to your inner truth instead of external expectations, you become visible. You stand out. You become an anomaly in the system. And systems don't like anomalies. Foucault argued that modern society created categories to deal with those who don't conform: the madman, the criminal, the deviant, the abnormal. These aren't just neutral descriptions, they're technologies of control. They're ways to identify, isolate, and correct those who threaten the established order. And the most insidious part is that these categories are presented as scientific truths, as objective facts about human nature. But Foucault showed that they're historical constructions created to serve specific purposes of power. Think about how society treats someone who doesn't fit. First, there's the attempted diagnosis. Does this person have a disorder? Do they need treatment? Are they antisocial? Do they have adjustment problems? These questions aren't neutral. They already presuppose that the problem is in the individual, not in the system. They already assume that conformity is health and divergence is pathology. Foucault invites us to flip this question. What if the problem isn't the individual, but the system that demands conformity? What if the real madness is unconscious submission to norms we haven't examined? When you start seeing this, when you start questioning the categories society uses to define normality, something profound happens. You can no longer participate in the collective illusion with the same innocence. You see power structures operating in everyday conversations, in family expectations, in work dynamics. You see how people police each other, how they reinforce norms without even realizing it. And this vision creates distance, not because you become arrogant or superior, but because you can no longer pretend you don't see what you see. Foucault had a fascinating concept called power knowledge. He argued that power and knowledge aren't separate things. They produce each other. Who has the power to define what counts as valid knowledge? Who decides what is truth? Who determines which questions are worth asking? In modern society, it's experts, institutions, authorized discourses. Doctors tell us what health is. Psychologists tell us what mental normality is. Economists tell us what's rational. Educators tell us what's important to learn. And these definitions aren't just descriptive, they're prescriptive. They shape what we become. But here's Foucault's radical insight. These knowledge systems aren't neutral or objective. They serve specific interests. They produce specific types of subjects. The educational system doesn't just transmit information. It produces disciplined individuals capable of following instructions, of sitting still for hours, of accepting authority. The medical system doesn't just treat diseases. It defines what a normal body is, what healthy behavior is, who needs intervention. The economic system doesn't just organize production. It creates a certain conception of what it means to be human, Homo economicus, the rational individual who maximizes their interests. When you start seeing this, when you start questioning not just the answers but the very questions we're given, you become dangerous. Not violently dangerous, but epistemologically dangerous. You threaten the knowledge structures that keep the system functioning, and the reaction is predictable. First, you're ignored. Then you're ridiculed. Your intelligence is questioned. Your motivations are suspect. You're accused of being negative, of being difficult, of creating problems where none exist. And if you persist, if you keep questioning, you're isolated. People stop inviting you. Conversations become superficial. You become an outsider. Foucault lived this personally. He was gay at a time when homosexuality was pathologized, criminalized, considered a mental illness. He experienced firsthand how society uses categories of normality to control, exclude, and punish. He understood that those who don't fit into established categories aren't just socially marginalized, they're constructed as abnormal, as problems to be solved. And this construction isn't just external, it's internalized. Those who are labeled as deviant often begin to see themselves through these labels, to doubt themselves, to try to correct themselves. But Foucault also saw something different. He saw that resistance is possible, that we can refuse the categories imposed on us, that we can create new forms of being, new relationships, new ways of existing that don't conform to established norms. He called this aesthetics of existence, the idea that we can treat our lives as works of art, creating ourselves according to our own values, not according to standards imposed by society. But this self-creation has a cost. It requires courage. It requires solitude. It requires the willingness to be misunderstood. If you write in the comments, "I see the system but I can't participate in it anymore," you understand what Foucault was talking about. You've experienced the cost of consciousness. Foucault had another profound insight about how modern power works. He argued that power isn't just repressive, it isn't just about saying no, about prohibiting, about limiting. Modern power is productive. It creates things. It produces realities, rituals of truth, domains of objects and discourses. It produces subjectivities. It teaches us who to be. Think about how this works in practice. Society doesn't just prohibit certain behaviors. It actively defines what a good citizen is, a good worker, a good father, a good mother. It gives us models, examples, ideals to be achieved, and we internalize these ideals. We strive to become what we're told we should be. The educational system is a perfect example. It doesn't just punish failure, it actively rewards certain types of success. It creates a ladder of achievement, grades, diplomas, certificates that motivate us to conform. It defines what intelligence is, what's worth knowing, how knowledge should be demonstrated, and those who don't fit this model, who learn differently, who have different interests, who question the system itself, are marked as failures, not because they're not intelligent, but because their intelligence isn't recognized by the system. Foucault showed that this happens in all spheres of life. The health system defines what a healthy body is, and then creates an entire industry around helping people achieve that ideal. The economic system defines what financial success is, and then structures our entire lives around pursuing that success. The relationship system defines what normal love is, appropriate intimacy, acceptable family structures. And in each case, those who don't conform are seen as deficient in some way, as needing help, correction, therapy. But here's what Foucault wants us to understand. These norms aren't natural. They're not universal truths about human nature. They're specific historical constructions that serve specific interests, and they can be questioned, resisted, transformed. When you see this, when you truly understand that the norms governing your life aren't inevitable, something liberating happens. You realize you have choices. You can refuse the ideals you've been given. You can create your own standards of the good life, but this freedom comes with a price. When you stop pursuing the goals everyone else pursues, when you stop measuring your worth by the metrics society provides, you become incomprehensible to others. They don't understand what you're doing. They don't see value in your choices. They might even feel that your mere existence is an implicit critique of their own lives. If you can opt out, if you can find meaning outside the system, what does that say about those who are still fully invested in it? Foucault argued that every society has what he called a regime of truth, a set of discourses that society accepts as true, mechanisms that distinguish true from false statements, techniques for obtaining truth, the status of those who decide what's true. And these regimes of truth aren't neutral. They're intimately linked to power. Who has the power to define truth has power over how we live. In the modern era, science has become our dominant regime of truth. And don't misunderstand me, Foucault wasn't rejecting science or claiming all facts are equally valid. He was pointing to something more subtle, that scientific discourse, like any discourse, has limits, exclusions, blind spots. It defines certain questions as legitimate and others as meaningless. It values certain types of evidence and dismisses others. It creates authorities, experts who have the power to speak truth. And here's where it gets interesting. When you start questioning not just specific answers, but the very frame of reference, when you ask questions that the dominant regime of truth considers illegitimate, you're immediately marginalized. You're accused of being anti-scientific, irrational, conspiratorial. Your questioning is pathologized. And again, the message is clear: conform or be excluded. Foucault saw this happen repeatedly throughout history. Those who questioned the truth regimes of their times, who challenged established authorities, who proposed alternative ways of understanding the world, were systematically silenced, not necessarily through open violence, though that happened too, but through more subtle mechanisms, ridiculed, ignored, deprived of platforms, excluded from institutions, labeled as unreliable. And the most disturbing part is that these exclusion mechanisms are presented as necessary protections against irrationality, as defenses of truth and reason. But Foucault invites us to ask, who decides what counts as rational? Who determines which questions are worth asking? Who benefits from keeping certain questions off limits? If you've felt that your questions are constantly dismissed, that your concerns are seen as illegitimate, that you're treated as if you're thinking incorrectly simply because you're thinking differently, you're experiencing what Foucault described. You're bumping against the limits of what the current truth regime allows to be questioned. But Foucault wasn't a nihilist. He wasn't saying there's no truth or that everything is equally valid. He was saying we must be constantly vigilant about how truth discourses function, who they serve, what they exclude, and he believed there's always possibility for resistance, for creating new truths, new discourses, new forms of understanding. One of Foucault's most powerful concepts is biopolitics, the idea that modern power doesn't just govern through laws and prohibitions, but through the management of life itself, public health, demography, hygiene, birth rates, longevity. The modern state cares deeply about the life of its population, but this concern isn't just benevolent, it's a form of control. When the state defines what a healthy, productive, normal life is, it's simultaneously defining which lives are valuable and which aren't. Foucault showed how this manifests in policies that seem neutral or even good. Public health campaigns, educational programs, welfare policies, all these initiatives have a dual function. They genuinely help people, but they also normalize them, discipline them, shape them into specific types of citizens. And those who don't conform, who don't adhere to standards of healthy, productive, normal living, are seen as problems, as burdens on the system, as needing intervention. Think about how this works today. If you don't fit productivity standards, if you're not constantly seeking to improve, optimize, maximize, you're seen as lazy or unmotivated. If you question the cultural emphasis on constant achievement, you're accused of being negative or defeatist. If you opt out of the rat race, you're seen as a failure, regardless of how intentionally and consciously you made that choice. Foucault would argue that this pressure for constant optimization, this demand for endless productivity, isn't just about economic efficiency. It's a form of biopolitical control. It's a way to extract maximum value from every body, from every life. And those who resist, who say, I don't want to participate in this logic, who opt for less productive but more meaningful forms of life, are seen as threats to the system. The loneliness you might be feeling, this sense of being a stranger in your own world, might simply be the result of refusing this program, of saying your life isn't about maximizing production or hitting externally defined success metrics, but society doesn't have an easy category for this, so you become unclassifiable. And the unclassifiable is always unsettling to those who live by categories. If you write in the comments, I chose to leave the race, but people think I gave up, you know exactly what Foucault was talking about. But Foucault also gave us tools for resistance. He argued that where there's power, there's resistance. Power is never total, never complete. There are always cracks, spaces, possibilities to create something new. And resistance doesn't need to be grand or revolutionary. It can be small, local, personal. It can be simply refusing to participate in certain games. It can be creating spaces where different forms of being are possible. It can be living according to your own values, even when that means solitude. Foucault spoke about what he called heterotopias, other spaces, places that exist within society but operate according to different principles. Gardens, cemeteries, theaters, libraries, places where normal rules are temporarily suspended, where different possibilities can be experimented with. And he suggested we can create our own heterotopias, our own islands of freedom, within the sea of normalization. Maybe your loneliness is exactly this, a heterotopia, a space where you don't need to conform, where you can be who you really are, where the rules that govern everyone else don't apply. This isn't failure, it's creation. You're creating a space of freedom in a world of control. And yes, that means you're alone. But maybe it's better to be alone and free than connected and imprisoned. Foucault also taught us about the importance of genealogy, the method of tracing how things we consider natural or inevitable actually have specific histories, beginnings, transformations. When you do genealogy of concepts like normality, madness, criminality, sexuality, you discover they didn't always mean what they mean now. They were constructed, contested, modified over time. And this realization is deeply liberating. If something was constructed, it can be deconstructed. If something has a history, it can have a different future. The categories that imprison us aren't eternal. They can be transformed. But this transformation begins with recognizing that they're constructions, not natures. When you begin doing genealogy of your own life, when you start asking where your beliefs, your desires, your values came from, you often discover that many of them aren't really yours. They were implanted by family, culture, media, education. You were taught to want certain things, to value certain outcomes, to fear certain possibilities. And this recognition creates a space for choice. You can decide what to keep and what to discard. You can begin creating yourself deliberately instead of being created by the forces around you. But again, this conscious self-creation has a social cost. When you start living according to values you've consciously chosen, instead of values that were given to you, you inevitably distance yourself from those still living unconsciously, not through judgment, but through fundamental incompatibility. You're playing a different game, and those still playing the old game can't understand why you're not interested in playing with them. Foucault spent his final years exploring what he called care of the self. The idea that we must actively work on ourselves, cultivate our capacities, develop our relationship with ourselves. He looked at Greek and Roman antiquity and found an entire ethics of self-transformation that had been forgotten in the modern era. The idea that life is an art, that we must shape ourselves like a sculptor shapes clay. But Foucault also recognized that modern care of the self had been captured by the system. It was transformed into just another form of normalization. Self-help, personal development, optimization, all of this often just serves to make us better prisoners, better workers, more effective consumers, more docile citizens. True care of the self, Foucault argued, is radical. It's about creating yourself according to your own standards, not according to the system's standards. And this requires courage. It requires the willingness to be judged, misunderstood, isolated. It requires abandoning the need for external approval. It requires finding validation internally, in your own sense of integrity, of authenticity, of living according to your truth. Foucault lived this. He was openly gay when that was deeply scandalous. He explored alternative forms of relationship, pleasure, life. He refused to apologize for who he was, and he paid the price. He was often criticized, attacked, misunderstood, but he also found freedom. He created a life that was genuinely his. And through his example, he showed that it's possible to escape the prison, to live outside established categories, to create new forms of existence. If you're alone because you chose freedom over conformity, Foucault would say you're not alone in your solitude. You're part of a lineage of individuals throughout history who refused the prison, who insisted on living on their own terms. If this video resonated with you, if you recognized your own experience in this description of awakening and its consequences, you're not alone, even in your solitude. There are others who've made the same journey, who've paid the same price. Subscribe to this channel where I explore insights from the greatest thinkers about consciousness, freedom, and the cost of living authentically. Leave in the comments if you've experienced the isolation that comes from seeing what others don't see. Your story might help others going through the same transformation. Remember where we started. If you're alone, Maybe it's not because there's something wrong with you. Maybe it's because you've already escaped the invisible prison that Foucault spent his life exposing. You saw the bars, you recognized the guards, you understood how the system works. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to participating unconsciously. The question isn't whether you should try to fit in again. The question is what you do with your freedom. Foucault taught us that freedom isn't a state you achieve once and for all. It's an ongoing practice. It's constant work of resistance, creation, refusal to be defined by others. You're never completely free. There are always new forms of power trying to capture you, new discourses trying to normalize you, new categories trying to classify you. But you can always resist. You can always question. You can always create something new. Your loneliness, then, isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning. It's the space where you can begin creating yourself anew according to your own principle. It's liberation from the need for constant approval, from the demand for conformity. It's the opportunity to discover who you really are when you're not trying to be who others want you to be. Yes, it's difficult. Yes, it's lonely, but it's real. It's honest, it's free, and maybe in the end, that's the only thing that really matters. Not how many people understand you, but whether you're living according to your deepest truth. Foucault died young at 57 from AIDS-related complications at a time when the disease was still highly stigmatized. Even his death was shrouded in misunderstanding and judgment. But he left a legacy of radical thought that continues to inspire those who refuse to accept society's invisible prisons. He showed us that we can question everything, that nothing is as natural or inevitable as it seems. And he lived this truth, even when it meant isolation and incomprehension. So if you're alone, if you feel like you don't belong, if people have drifted away because you stopped playing the games everyone plays, remember this: you haven't failed socially. You've succeeded philosophically. You escape, and escape has always been a solitary act. But on the other side of the prison, even in solitude, there's something the prisoners will never know. Freedom, the freedom to be who you really are, to live according to your own values, to create your life as a work of art. And that freedom, Foucault would say, is worth any price. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.